The government just reported an upgrade to the already sizable second quarter GDP in the US. It's now just shy of 3%. And yet, it is wrong about where the economy is. How do we know it's wrong? For one thing, the US Treasury yield curve continues to uninvert in bull steepen and a strong recession warning. But that's only the beginning. That's only one piece. There's so much more to it. GDP is wrong, and like payrolls, it overstates the economy at these critical inflection points. How do we know? Well, because the other half of GDP says so, the better half, the one that gets inflections. You never ever hear about this other side of GDP. Yet it's the side that's validated by history, by academic studies, and I'll show you the details of that so you can see what I mean. It's the side that's confirmed by the marketplace, like treasuries, as I just said, the side far better globally synchronized with other important economies, and most of all, it aligns with how the vast majority of people see and feel about the economy. Now, they keep trying to downplay this as some kind of vibecession, some emotional outburst of a bunch of crybaby whiners. Nope. The evidence, including the GDP evidence, backs up people's perceptions. Regular folks all know the economy isn't strong, it sucks, and it's getting worse. Meanwhile, the one half of GDP will go on fooling economists in the media, lulling them into complacency, even as the other half of GDP continues to flash major warning signs. So while all those experts and economists and policymakers will be confused about why so few people like this economy, out there in the real world, businesses and consumers and workers, they have to deal with a reality that leads to things like Dollar General stock crashing another 25%. And it's not down because of everything being just fine according to GDP. Instead, as Dollar General's CEO said, while we believe the softer sales trends are partially attributable to a core customer who feels financially constrained, we know the importance of controlling what we can control. In other words, the economy sucks and it's hampering their customers. Customers don't have money to shop at Dollar General. But it's not just low-income consumers. It's also the middle class. We keep coming back to this theme over and over again. In addition to Dollar General, which just reported really sobering earnings and more so forecasts, Lululemon was another one. Middle-income women apparently aren't shopping in the same way they were before because they reported sobering and concerning results too. According to Bloomberg, the company now sees sales of as much as $10.48 billion this year, down from the previous view of as much as $10.8 billion offered in early June. So a big change just in a couple months, but it's the same couple months where we keep getting warning after warning. In other words, summertime is indeed the time for recession. Chief Financial Officer Megan Frank said the cut was due to, here we go, uncertainties in the economy, including a shorter holiday season, no, not really, and the upcoming elections, which has absolutely nothing to do with how consumers spend. Sales growth in North America is slowing just as shoppers contend with inflation, nope, higher interest rates, nope, and a cooling job market. That's the one. And when you look at global comparable sales for Lululemon, look at where they fell off in the company's second and third quarters. The timing also lines up with everything else. So their sales start to soften a couple months ago. They start seeing it in their results. They start talking about uncertainties in the economy, which is the buzzword all these companies use. And it doesn't line up with second quarter GDP being up around 3%. Not only that, the government upgraded its GDP estimate for the second quarter to around 3%, largely based on accelerating consumer spending. So none of this adds up, at least from the perspective of GDP. And that's one reason why economists and the media have dismissed all of these warning signs all throughout this year and really going back to last year too. They keep calling it derisively this vibecession. Everybody feels like it's a recession, but look at GDP, the number's absolutely great. Look at payrolls, the number, well, it used to look great. Look at the unemployment rate, that's no longer a good one either. I talked about this in a video a couple weeks ago, where this happens in every recession cycle. And I gave you an example from June of 2008, right in the middle of the Great Not Recession. The numbers look pretty good at first, GDP in particular, as we'll go over in just a moment. Yet, we have other warning signs, including how people feel about the economy, that just gets ignored because GDP looks good. This is what the Washington Post wrote in June of 2008. Ask Americans how the economy is doing, and their answer is stark. It is not just bad, it is run for the hills terrible. Consumer confidence is at its lowest level in almost 30 years, and only 12% of Americans think the economy is in good shape. It's like they're talking about 2024. But they say the reality is different. According to most broad measures of how the economy is doing, it's not all that grim. Again, sounds really familiar. This has left economists trying to figure out why Americans' perceptions are so much more negative than the data analysts use to measure how things are going. And that's really the problem that we're hitting here. The data that analysts use to measure how the economy is going sometimes looks very different from how people perceive the economic situation. And what we continue to come back to in these cycle inflections, like the middle 2008, is that the people are right and the economists and their few measures are wrong. They're using the wrong measures to come up with their view of where the economy actually is. They usually look at things like GDP is the first one, then the payroll report, which up until recently in 2024, the payroll report was, hey, everything's just fine here as well. Then the QCEW comes out and we realize not just that the payroll is overstating jobs, it also overstated the downside trajectory. In other words, the labor market, according to the QCEW, is slowing down much faster than anyone had anticipated using the establishment survey. So payrolls is no longer a good one either. And the third one everybody always uses is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate, what they say is, well, the unemployment's rising a little bit, but it's still incredibly low. They said the same things back in 2008, say the same things back in 2000 and 2001. Yes, the unemployment rate's up a little bit, but it's incredibly low. And then it starts rising much faster, and suddenly something like the Psalm rule gets tripped. And even economists start to fret that maybe all these other measures that they've been relying on are just false signals, starting with GDP. And it doesn't sound like GDP should be a false signal because it's the biggest statistic there is, the most comprehensive. It's put together objectively using statistical processes that have been validated and reviewed and edited throughout history. So how can it possibly be wrong? Well, the other side of GDP actually says, especially at these particular inflection points in the economic cycles, it tends to be wrong. It tends to overstate the strength of the economy, whereas this other side of GDP picks up on the weakness that eventually turns into a recession. And I'm talking about the other side of GDP being GDI, or gross domestic income. For every dollar that's spent in the economy, which is tracked under GDP, the expenditure-side approach, that's a dollar of income to someone or somebody else in the economy. So that's the income side, gross domestic income. And the two series should match together, and more often than not, they actually do. Though they do noticeably diverge at these cyclical inflection points. One academic study that looked into this matter, the divergences between GDP and GDI, especially around cyclical inflections, was one that was prepared by an economist at the Federal Reserve, the Board of Governors there, a fellow by the name of Jeremy Nalewaik. And it's called The Income and Expenditure Side Estimates of U.S. Output Growth. This paper reports a broad range of results that indicate that GDI better reflects the business cycle fluctuations and true output growth. Results on revisions to the estimates and correlations with numerous other cyclically sensitive variables, which is exactly what we're talking about here, are particularly favorable to GDI. The most recent GDI data show the 2007 to 2009 downturn to have been considerably worse than is reflected in GDP. And one of the corresponding relationships is with the unemployment rate. And so what the paper investigated is, okay, which GDP, GDI, which one is better correlated and corresponding with other cyclical indicators that are also validated through these cyclical processes. And during these periods, GDI should match GDP, but we often see GDI going in one direction, closer to the unemployment rate, whereas GDP looks much better and much stronger. Back to the paper. Charles Fleischman and John Roberts have studied the relationships among GDP and GDI, as well as the unemployment rate and other variables in the context of a state space model of the business cycle. They're economists, they got to use econometrics. Their work points to the unemployment rate as an excellent measure of the state of the business cycle. It also suggests that GDP, the expenditure side, is measured with more error than GDP with the income side, or GDI. And the paper's work shows that the measurement errors in either GDI or GDP are clearly systemically related to the business cycle. And this statistical discrepancy is not noise as is commonly assumed. In other words, GDP and GDI diverge more clearly during these cyclical inflection points. When we see a business cycle changing in something like the unemployment or the other variables that the paper went into, we see that GDP and GDI tend to go in different directions during those inflection periods. So which one do we rely on? And why would GDP overstate the economy during these cyclical inflection points? Well, the paper says, probably more important, over most of the sample, the type of annual surveys used to compute the goods producing sector of GDP, the expenditure side, simply did not exist for most of the enormous service producing sector. As a consequence, the BEA was forced to cobble together estimates based on trade source, administrative, and regulatory data, which may have missed part of the business cycle. For example, these data sources may miss fluctuations in the output of sole proprietors and some small businesses, both of which are highly cyclical. However, many of these firms and entities likely did file tax forms, so their activities would have been represented in the tax data used to compute GDI. This could explain part of the increase in the statistical discrepancy in 1989, 2001, and the latest episode, which was 2007, 8, and 2009. In other words, GDP, as we move more and more to a services-oriented economy, didn't have the same statistical and surveying techniques for the services part of the economy that they did for the goods part of the economy. So they cobbled together a bunch of stuff to try to measure what's in the services part of the economy and may be missing these cyclical turns because they don't see them in the data that they use to put together the expenditure side of the economy. Whereas GDI income, which is supposed to validate what's in GDP, as the paper was pointing out, they have actual evidence and access to things like tax returns that show that income was becoming weaker on the GDI side than is being picked up and recorded in GDP. So GDP does not do a good enough job picking up cyclical inflections. And we see this discrepancy when the unemployment rate goes up, which tells us that the discrepancy shows up during these cyclical turning points. So when we look at the actual data, the historical examples of GDP versus GDI, you go back to 2005, 2006, 2007, you see GDI was a little bit stronger in 2005, which wasn't necessarily unusual. Again, there's small differences during various time periods. But then GDP was steadier as it was designed. And we get into 2007, the subprime mortgage crisis that was far more than subprime mortgages. And you can see already in the first quarter of 2007, GDI starts to get weak. But then there's a big drop in GDI in the third quarter of 2007 when the U.S. economy and the global economy was being hit by the initial eruption of the global not financial crisis. At the same time, though, GDP kept on going, which looked pretty solid. And even in the first half of 2008, while there was a downturn in GDP in the first quarter, negative GDP in the first quarter of 2008, it rebounded pretty sharply in the second quarter, so that it looked like by the middle of 2008, when that Washington Post article was being written, the economy was kind of hanging in there despite this massive global financial crisis that was not financial, but it was global, raging throughout the world. Whereas GDI said we're in more trouble than you can appreciate using GDP. So the vibecession was a vibecession only when you look at GDP. When you looked at GDI, it was validating those perceptions that people were talking about in terms of lower consumer confidence and everything else. It wasn't a vibecession. It was that the media and economists and experts were using the wrong signal. They were using and depending upon the wrong data, the data that is understandably unable to capture these cyclical changes. So as of the current update, GDP for the second quarter comes out. They revised the growth rate higher from around 2.8% to a little bit above 2.9%. And it did so because, according to the BEA, on the GDP side of the economy, consumers spent a little bit more than they initially thought, which just does not correspond with anything that we're seeing in the actual economy. I mean, not just Dollar Tree or Lululemon. We've got Macy's, Target, McDonald's, Home Depot, Lowe's, Walgreens. Did I miss? I mean, just pretty much everyone in the corporate sector. And it's not just the corporate sector, as I talked about in my last video. The services side of the economy doesn't look all that good either. So GDP says the economy is great. History, as well as academic studies and the marketplace, say don't don't put too much attention in GDP. Look at GDI. And with the second estimate of GDP, we get the first initial estimate for GDI in the second quarter, and it looks nothing like GDP. So where GDP, the expenditure side, is up around 3% quarter over quarter at annual rate, GDI is down around 1%, just 1.06%. And more importantly, it is clearly slowing down. It has been slower really over the last couple of years. There was a little bit of a pickup in the second half of last year, ending in the fourth quarter. But so far in the first half of this year, GDI is decelerating, which is consistent with everything that we keep talking about and seeing in the general economy. So what you see really is that GDI began picking up on the weakness in the general economy back in 2022, right when curves were telling us something was going wrong. So while GDP had the technical recession in the first half of 2022, it wasn't as much in GDI, but it was definitely a noticeable inflection point. But from the third quarter of 2022 onward, GDP has been going up like there's no... It's a different rate. It's definitely a slowdown, but it's nowhere near something that would look like a recession. Whereas GDI, on the other hand, looks a lot like data that we see around the rest of the world. GDI has been more flat to lower than GDP. It's not just a vibecession of emotion. It's right here in the data. And more importantly, maybe most important, it's globally synchronized, because we live in a globally synchronized economy, a globally synchronized system. It's not like the US is just doing its own thing, whereas, say, for example, Europe has fallen into a recession right around the same period in time, the third and fourth quarter of 2022. But when we line up, say, European GDP with US GDP, it looks like two different economies. Yes, the US has slowed down, but Europe has fallen into recession. But when we line up US GDI with, say, European GDP, GDI looks a lot more like European GDP and much more globally synchronized. The data for GDI's version of the economy over the last couple of years is all over the place, where GDP is increasingly isolated as an outlier. In the end, GDI is just far more consistent in every conceivable way. Starting with the history of both series, GDI is better able to pick up on the weakness that leads to downturn and recession. And over the last couple years, GDI is far more consistent with the market signals that we've been getting. Back in 2022, the yield curve inverted, which said the economy's in for a rough ride. And whereas GDP initially picked up on that same weakness, it then went off in a different direction, making people think that everything was just fine. Whereas GDI, like the market signals, said everything was not just fine. It's most consistent with other places around the world. Globally synchronized. We see the recession data and say European GDP, and GDI looks a lot more like Europe and these other signals than GDP does. That's an important deviation there as well. But maybe most important of all, GDI backs up what people have been saying about the economy for the last couple years. It's not been strong. It's not been resilient. It's been quite the opposite. GDI is more evidence amidst a sea of strong evidence, all saying that all the experts and all the so-called economists need to listen. They need to listen to what people are saying instead of looking at a few numbers and immediately dismissing the public's concern. Those numbers aren't even the right numbers. So economy that's much weaker than you thought it was before using GDP is now much closer to recession than you were ever willing to consider. And one that's already been halfway into recession, as GDI has been pointing out, as people have been pointing out all along, it really wouldn't take much to push it over the edge. We are indeed seeing troubling signs on the services side of the economy. I went over some of those in the video linked below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.